Hola, hola, yo soy Hassan Akram y quiero darles la bienvenida a una nueva edición de mi serie Lecciones Aprendidas, excepto que hoy día tenemos un capítulo especial, Lecciones No Aprendidas, el difícil camino hacia la paz, que es una serie sobre la crisis y la guerra entre Rusia y Ucrania. Y tenemos un invitado muy especial, una persona que yo personalmente he admirado, de hecho, desde el colegio, Boris Kagarlitsky, un sociólogo, un cientista político, profesor de la Universidad Estatal de Moscú y antes de la Academia Rusa de Ciencias. Un gran hombre, un marxista que hace tremendo análisis de todo lo que es el mundo postsoviético. Y vamos a preguntarle, viene en camino, sobre la crisis entre Rusia y Ucrania y las justificaciones por la invasión rusa. Pero antes de entrar en la entrevista con él, quería dar un pequeño resumen de la historia de ese país. Tenemos un mapa, de hecho, para explicar dónde queda Ucrania. Y si uno mira ese mapa, lo que es muy evidente es la división lingüística cultural del país, porque la parte occidente está fuertemente alineado con la Unión Europea, hablan ucraniano, y la parte oriente habla ruso y su economía es mucho más vinculada con los países de la ex Unión Soviética. Entonces, esa división cultural, social en el país genera una polarización política. De hecho, esa polarización llegó a un punto culmine en 2004, cuando el político pro-europeo, Viktor Yushchenko, ganó contra el líder pro-Putin, Viktor Yanukovych. Y Putin envenenó a Yushchenko. De hecho, tenemos una foto muy fuerte donde se nota los efectos del envenenamiento que estamos viendo en este momento. Pero a pesar de ese acto de violencia de Putin, Yushchenko terminó siendo presidente democráticamente elegido de Ucrania, a pesar de la posición de Putin. Ahora, este héroe, supuestamente, esta persona que logró torcer la mano del Kremlin, después pierde la elección en 2010. ¿Y quién gana? Nada menos que el Viktor Yanukovych, el supuesto corrupto que era tan impopular que Putin tuvo que envenenar a su contrincante. ¿Por qué ganó Yanukovych y su partido de las regiones en 2010? Porque uno puede decir que un aliado de Putin no es necesariamente el mejor líder para un país, pero un aliado de Estados Unidos, como era Yushchenko, tampoco. Ahora, el gobierno de Yanukovych terminó con un estallido social, una explosión de malestar social en 2014, que terminó en las famosas protestas de Euromaidan. Sin embargo, esas protestas fueron un estallido tomado por la ultraderecha y ganó un presidente, Petro Poroshenko, que tenía el lema tan fascista, ejército, idioma y fe, y empezó a prohibir el idioma ruso, afectando la minoría grande, un 25-30% de la población de Ucrania que es ruso parlante. Y eventualmente el pueblo ucraniano se cansó de Poroshenko. Y en 2019 ganó un candidato de la paz, un candidato de hecho de la zona ruso parlante del país, un comediante judío, Volodymyr Zelensky, que hablaba de reunir el país, que hablaba de llegar a un diálogo de paz. A pesar de eso, Vladimir Putin dijo que al final su gobierno fue tomado por los nazis y invadió a Ucrania. Y en este momento estamos viendo una guerra sangrienta, están muriendo niños, están muriendo civiles, es una situación absolutamente trágica y no se entiende por qué ocurrió esa invasión. ¿Qué está pasando en ese pobre país? Y entonces tenemos a Boris Kagarlitsky, creo que ahora está con nosotros para responder a nuestras dudas al respecto. Entonces quería empezar, profesor Kagarlitsky, preguntándole que Chile es un país muy traumado por 1973. Tenemos muy claro el peligro que representa el imperialismo estadounidense para la paz mundial. Entonces, cuando Putin dice, ojo, tuve que invadir a Ucrania, no tuvo otro remedio, ¿por qué la amenaza militar de la OTAN, la amenaza militar de Estados Unidos, es tan fuerte que era necesario la invasión para bloquear el vínculo entre Ucrania y la OTAN? ¿Qué piensa entonces de esta justificación de Putin? Usted, profesor Kagarlitsky, como un líder de la izquierda rusa, un líder de la izquierda rusa marxista, además sabe muy bien del peligro que representa Estados Unidos para la paz y para la seguridad de distintas naciones. Entonces, ¿le cree a Putin cuando él dice que eso es la justificación por su invasión ahora?
Let's start with explanations which Putin himself
Ya.
gave to his actions. And I think it's very telling that his explanations were extremely contradictory. Because on the one hand, he said that it was Ukraine's plan to join the NATO bloc, which he presented as a cause for his action. But the fact is that Ukraine didn't get any closer to joining NATO than it was, say, 5 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago. So in that sense, there was no major progress. And yes, there are Ukrainian politicians who keep saying, or rather kept saying, that they were interested in NATO. But the big problem was that NATO was not very interested in Ukraine. So in that sense, the irony of the situation was that, yes, Ukraine was kind of knocking at the door of NATO for, I think, more than 20 years with very little result. Why? Well, because Ukraine is a big problem. So it's a country, at least it used to be a country with tremendous domestic conflicts, with unstable governments, with unstable political situation, and NATO was not interested in messing up into all this situation.
Ok, entonces el argumento de que la OTAN fue una amenaza directa a Rusia que justificó la guerra, obviamente no cuadra con el timing, con el cronograma de la invasión, porque no hubo un acto que gatilló esa invasión desde la OTAN. Sin embargo, sigue existiendo una amenaza más de mediano, largo plazo, donde la OTAN claramente está amenazando la seguridad de Rusia. Eso sí se podría resolver no mediante una guerra, sino con negociaciones diplomáticas, distintas formas de obligar a Ucrania a distanciarse de la alianza militar de Estados Unidos. Pero ahí hay un problema, porque Putin dice: no se puede seguir con las negociaciones diplomáticas ahora que los nazis han tomado Ucrania. Eso es su otro gran argumento, que fue necesaria la invasión para desnazificar a Ucrania. Y hemos visto muchas imágenes de la ultraderecha siendo muy activa como parte de las acciones militares en Ucrania. Entonces, ¿no le parece, profesor, una verdadera preocupación y una necesidad la desnazificación de Ucrania?
Putin mentioned Nazis in Ukraine, different far-right groups. I think they're not exactly Nazis, but they're definitely far-right. They're definitely reactionary, and they're definitely dangerous. These are far-right Ukrainian nationalists, and they really create a lot of problems for the Ukrainian population, especially in the east of the country. But again, did something new happen? No. The situation is exactly the same as it used to be, say, 5 years ago, something. And that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is that similar groups of Russian fascists are quite prominent inside Russia itself. They are, by the way, these Russian fascists are exactly among those who praise the current war and the current invasion. So these groups were doing extremely well. So the question is, why didn't Putin think about denazifying his own country? And the answer is very simple. He is very much backed by these very, I shouldn't say fascist or Nazi, but far-right groups. And Putin himself, for example, in proving his point, used to quote quite a few times Ivan Ilyin. Who is Ivan Ilyin? Ivan Ilyin is the ideologue and the theoretician of Russian fascism. So Ivan Ilyin is also Putin's most kind of most beloved thinker. So in that sense, the question about who is the Nazi, who is the fascist is kind of
perfecto.
open.
Entonces Putin ni invadió por la amenaza directa de la OTAN y tampoco por la necesidad de desnazificar al país, porque al final Putin también está apoyado por nazis. Entonces, si no es un tema ni de desnazificación ni de la amenaza directa e inmediata de la OTAN, ¿cuál, en su opinión, fue la real razón por la invasión? ¿Cómo lo explica? ¿Cuáles fueron las razones o la razón por eso?
Well, the real reasons are totally domestic, because In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, there was a real support there was a real kind of increase of support for the government, for Putin's policies. I shouldn't say there was total enthusiasm, but there was a lot of enthusiasm in Russian society about the annexation of Crimea. And also one important thing to note is that Crimean people really did want to join Russia. This is very important. When Crimea was annexed, it was annexed with the massive support of the local population, which opposed Ukrainian government for years. And so all that was really supported by Russian population. And when Putin got involved in this crisis, he was also enjoying a lot of support from the people. That was called the so-called Crimean consensus. So the Crimean consensus, when the government and the people were more or less on the same side. And since then, a lot happened. Since then, the situation in Russia deteriorated. And in 2018, Russia started its pension reform. And I think Chileans who experienced a lot of neoliberal reforms do not have to be enlightened don't have to be told additional details about how these neoliberal reforms work. And actually, there were quite a few neoliberal reforms in Russia. They're going on, and most of them were, by the way, carried out under Putin's regime. But the important thing was exactly that the pension reform was their most unpopular action of Russian government, I think, since the 90s. Russian pension reform was very particular because the original idea was that they had two pension systems. There were two phases. In the first phase, they introduced a privatized pension system, but at the same time, they kept the traditional solidaristic Bismarckian pension system based on solidarity between generations, which was the so-called social pension. And so they had two systems working in a parallel way, but people were obliged to get some of their pension savings in the private funds. You were forced. It was obligatory that you had to give away some of your money into these private pension funds. So it was not a decision you made. It was not some kind of choice you made. It's okay that I'm risking with the private pension funds and they give the money to private pension funds, hoping that later I'm going to have higher pension. No, you were obliged to do that. It was not voluntarily, it was obligatory. And then this money, which was obligatory, moved into the private pension funds. This money was confiscated. That was how it worked. 90% of the population opposed it. It actually ruined quite a few families. And it not only became extremely unpopular, it also ruined the popularity and ruined the reputation of Putin completely, because for 18 years, every year, sometimes twice or three times a year, Putin repeated that as long as I am the president, pension reform is not going to happen. Then all of a sudden he proclaimed that pension reform was really necessary, and said that, well, you have to understand me. There is no choice. There is no alternative. Blah blah blah. Blah. The standard neoliberal mantra about no alternative, and he backed the reform himself, because often most reactionary, most unpopular reforms were carried out by the government, while Putin, as the president, kind of stayed aside and pretended that he had nothing to do with it. Pension reform met such a strong resistance that Putin had to intervene himself, and he did save the pension reform, but at the cost of ruining his popularity and his population with the people, popularity and his support with the people. And after that, he was actually becoming less and less popular, with more and more people being extremely hostile. And next year, they had elections. We had elections, which also were accompanied with incredible, fabulous fraud, with figures just reversed. So then some wise people in Putin's entourage developed a proposal that you have to do some sort of remake of 2014 with annexation of Crimea. So you need some short and victorious and kind of glorious war, which should continue for a few days, which would end up with some very clear and splendid victory. And that would be the remake of the 2014, the remake of Crimea Consensus, and that would bring back your popularity and so on and so on. That was basically some kind of political technology. It was not very much about Russian-Ukrainian relations. They were just looking what could be potentially the next war. They even thought about fighting a war against Kazakhstan, maybe, especially because in Kazakhstan there was some kind of revolutionary upheaval, so maybe some sort of intervention into Kazakhstan and a victory against so-called rebels in Kazakhstan would be a better idea. Then Chinese said that it was not so good idea, so Russian bureaucrats changed their mind and came back to the idea of fighting against Ukraine. So the first they decided to have a war, and then they were just looking who would be the proper adversary for that war. So that was the way decisions were made. And this is very Putinite Russian way of making decisions, because you should understand in Russia, PR is everything. So the way government circles rule the country is mainly through PR and propaganda. It's not even through administrative measures, not even through repressions, by the way. In terms of repressions, yes, situation is getting worse and worse day by day, but well, there are quite a few dictatorships which are much more severe than our authoritarian regime. So in that sense, the main tool of the government is public relations and propaganda system. So that's why the whole thing about this war was very domestic. It was very much the PR operation, and that's why so many people are going to do this invasion, because we thought, okay, rather simulate the war. Simulating the war for propaganda purposes would have been a much better solution, which would have worked and fit the purpose.
Oka, entiendo su argumento que la invasión de Putin tenía justificación para él doméstica. Realmente fue nada más que una jugada para distraer de su impopularidad después de haber apoyado a esa reforma pro-AFP. Sin embargo, eso no hace que la invasión sea injustificable. A veces malas personas, por malas razones, hacen cosas buenas. En ese sentido, uno podría decir que Putin tuvo malas razones para invadir a Ucrania, pero de todas formas, la amenaza de la ultraderecha en Ucrania es algo real, y la invasión fue la única forma de frenarla. O sea, estamos hablando de la necesidad de invadir para frenar un líder aún más peligroso que Putin, que sería la figura de Vladimir Zelensky. Putin dice que es un nazi, pero al otro lado tenemos a la prensa occidental diciendo que es nada más que un salvador de la patria, un héroe nacional. Entonces, profesor, quería preguntarle cuál es su opinión de Vladimir Zelensky. ¿Es un salvador o es un fascista?
Well, he's neither. He's neither. Well, let's start with the fact. Of course, Zelensky is no fascist. He is a Jewish actor, a Jewish comedian. Which is not a very good kind of characteristic for a fascist dictator. Well, let's start with his history. He is, as I told you, he's a very funny Jewish comedian. He's a brilliant actor. He played the main role in this series called Servant of the People. where he played a teacher who suddenly became the president of the republic, and was kind of trying to do some sort of anti-system policies within the system, and kind of fails, by the way, in most of the series. Finally, of course, the last episodes are shown that he suddenly begins to win everything. But most of the film is about him failing to overcome the system. By the way, among other things, he's fighting against the IMF and doing some other progressive things in the film. So the film is very progressive, by the way, and it's worth seeing. And then when people elected him, they thought that they elected this character from the movie, from the series, which has nothing to do with reality. He's a good actor. He played this role, but it doesn't mean that he was anything to do with the character he played. So the first thing I said, he's a good actor. He's a brilliant comedian. He's a kind of Jewish intellectual with a sense of humor and kind of capacity of making himself look very sympathetic and nice and attractive and so on. But he was a very bad president. His presidency was a total failure. That was one of the reasons also for Putin's entourage to think that everything would collapse. Because his policies were totally opposite to what people expected him to do. He promised to establish peace on Donbass. He promised to achieve peace. He didn't achieve peace. There was no real war, but there was no peace either. So there was kind of semi-frozen conflict. So he failed on Donbass. People expected him to restore welfare state. Instead, he continued dismantling the welfare state. People expected him to actually really go after the far right, really go after the Nazis. He didn't do anything about that. People expected him to return the status of Russian language, which is spoken by at least half of the population, maybe 60% of the population of Ukraine. And everybody knew that till he became the president of the republic, he didn't even know Ukrainian language. He learned it while being the president. And even now he makes quite a few mistakes in Ukrainian when he speaks. Well, he didn't do anything to reestablish the status of Russian language. On the contrary, the offensive on the Russian language continued. The answer to these questions, why didn't he do anything about this, is that he seemed to have very little power. He seemed to be totally unable to control anything. So different groups and the different elements of bureaucracy and oligarchs continued to run the show, and actually different groups were carrying out their own agendas, and he was totally unable to really control and influence everything. His team was extremely incompetent and was not able to take over control. So his presidency was a total failure. And then Putin's invasion started, and it reversed the situation for many reasons, among other things. First, it seems that quite a lot of oligarchs and top influential figures of the Ukrainian elite simply ran away. They left the country, they fled, while Zelensky stayed over. This is one thing. So some of the people who were trying to influence the process and tried to do it just bypassing the presidential office simply disappeared from the scene. So in that sense, presidency became much stronger. Now Zelensky has more power than he ever had before Russian invasion, because before that he seemed to have very little power. Coming back to what I started with, is that Zelensky is a brilliant actor. So he understood the role of a national leader, the role of a savior, the role of the person who is standing for the nation. And he's playing a role. And he's playing this role brilliantly. As I told you, he's a brilliant actor. He failed with the role of the president, which he played brilliantly in a film, but he failed in reality. Now it seems that he doesn't have to do much except speaking and presenting an image of a heroic national leader. I think the actual administration is done by other people, mostly by the military. I don't know what's going to happen once the war is over. I'm afraid he's going to be back to the business as usual. It's not necessarily going to be good. But the role he's playing now is probably his best achievement as an actor.
Curiosamente, escuchando su interpretación de Zelensky y también su análisis de Putin, me parece que uno podría tener un optimismo frente a las negociaciones de paz entre Rusia y Ucrania. Porque si Putin no es un nacionalista expansionista obsesionado con recuperar Ucrania para la madre Rusia, sino simplemente un caudillo obsesionado con su popularidad local, entonces él podría aceptar una victoria simbólica en la zona, ¿no? Una aceptación de Ucrania de nunca aliarse con la OTAN. Y con esa victoria simbólica, él podría ir a su público y decir, mira, gané. Y al otro lado, si Zelensky no es ese salvador de la patria, sino simplemente un reformista bastante débil, él podría también aceptar la posición rusa y ceder en esas negociaciones. Excepto que hay un problema un poco más fuerte, y quería llevarle entonces a ese tema más espinoso, que tiene que ver con la región de Donbass, donde Putin juró proteger esa zona y específicamente los movimientos separatistas prorrusos, ¿no? Hay dos repúblicas que declararon la independencia, Donetsk y Lugansk, que es la zona de Donbass, y Putin dice que ellos tienen que ser independientes. Al otro lado, Zelensky dice que ellos tienen que ser parte de Ucrania. Y eso sí, una diferencia fuerte. Yo sé que usted ha trabajado harto sobre la zona de Donbass y entiende muy bien lo que está pasando en esa guerra de baja intensidad que lleva 8 años entre Ucrania y Rusia. ¿Cuál es el compromiso real de Putin con esa zona? ¿Y eso podría ser un piedra de tope para el proceso de paz?
Why did the left in Russia, even those who were very critical of Putin, who were very much opposed to Putin, of course, why all of us, not all of us, but by far most of us, supported Donbass? Because it was an uprising which was more or less fueled by social anger. It was very much working class. It was very much the confused working class, because very often instead of calling for social change, they were often thinking that, okay, if we are taken by Russia, if we are integrated into Russia, things are going to get better. But it was very much social discontent which fueled the uprising. And in 2014, I spent a lot of time in Belgorod, which is very close to Ukrainian border, just teaching at a school for Ukrainian social activists and labor activists, which were not just from Donbass, they were from other places. And we were actually training the cadre for the future Donetsk and Lugansk Republic, the cadre which were later purged by the Russian Putin's puppets.
Wow.
But it's very interesting because they had a lot of illusions about Russia. They said Russia is a welfare state. Russia is a state which is not ruled by oligarchy. Russia is a state where human rights are respected, and so on. So in that sense, they had enormous illusions about Russia, and we, by the way, tried to explain to them that Russia was not going to solve their problems and so on. But the very illusions they had about Russia explains much about the meaning, the purpose of this uprising, you see. So it was not just about nationalism. It was very much about social change, and they expected Russia to deliver the social change. And by the way, to some extent, it was correct, because by then, the level social deconstruction, the level of destruction of a welfare state in Ukraine was higher than in Russia, even now, actually. Ukraine dismantled more of its welfare state than Russia did. So in that sense, the illusions about Russia were not completely without some reason. So they had a completely exaggerated idea of Russian welfare state, but they were fighting for the welfare state. Basically, that was the idea. And Donetsk and Lugansk, the first original constitutions, which people actually tried to write just on the streets. It was incredible. People were just gathering in the streets, discussing the future constitution of Donetsk and Lugansk republics. Just crowds of people,
Wow.
just people sitting in the squares, discussing what kind of constitution they were going to have. It was very democratic, and they all insisted that we have to bring back the welfare state. It was not very much about nationalization or socialism, but welfare state was the central idea of that. And yes, they thought Russia would come in and establish the welfare state, or help them establishing the welfare state. And then, emissaries from the Kremlin arrived and said, what kind of welfare state? We don't care. That's not what we are about. We need you to be de facto part of Russia, but we're not going to integrate you officially into Russia. So we will control everything. We will control every decision, but we will not let you being citizens of Russian Federation and being part of Russian Federation. Will not let you elect your own leaders. For example, the leaders were imposed from Russia. The original leaders of the uprising, such as Alexei Mozgovoi, who was also called the Lugansk Che Guevara.
Долго говорить не буду, скажу только одно. Бригада «Призрак» стояла за интерес народа и будет стоять. И мы построим Новороссию народную и социалистическую.
He was killed, and everybody knows that he was not killed by the Ukrainians, Ukrainian terrorists or Ukrainian special forces, as the official version claims. Everybody knew it was not the Ukrainian special forces. These were the Russian special forces, which killed him and a few other leaders of the uprising. And, people were extremely frustrated. They were not integrated into Russia. Russia didn't do anything to protect them from shelling from the Ukrainian side. Actually, when there were days of active fighting, yes, then Russian troops were involved, and Russian tanks and artillery played a role in defending these republics in 2014. And by the way, in that sense, there was no real danger for them to be overrun by Ukrainian army, because they were quite well protected at that moment. But then nothing else was done. I know quite a lot of people who were there as volunteers, going to fight for Donetsk and Lugansk, and then they all returned back. And now quite a few of these people are opposing the war with Ukraine, and quite a few of these people are fighting on the other side these days. The policies of the Kremlin were actually the betrayal of Lugansk and Donetsk, and now they're paying the price.
Qué historia más triste. Y una historia que se cuenta poco en América Latina. Acá sabemos muy bien cómo es el imperialismo estadounidense, cómo la Casa Blanca ha destruido a gobiernos que buscan transformaciones sociales profundas, cómo Estados Unidos destruye movimientos sociales. Pero nos olvidamos entonces que el imperialismo ruso y el Kremlin es capaz de hacer exactamente lo mismo. Es tan triste pensar que todo el optimismo, toda la esperanza del levantamiento de Donbass quedó en nada producto de la violencia y el sabotaje de Putin. No nos queda mucho que esperar que ojalá se llegue a una paz negociada y los movimientos sociales puedan reconstruirse en esa zona y también en Ucrania en completo. Bueno, estamos llegando al fin entonces, profesor, de este capítulo de Lecciones No Aprendidas. Quería decirle muchas gracias, Boris Kagarlitsky, por venir a hablar con la voz de los que sobran. Y para nuestra audiencia quiere decir que pronto vamos a estar de vuelta en una nueva edición de Lecciones Aprendidas, El difícil camino de la paz, un programa de la voz de los que sobran. Gracias.